document does not explain the basis for including the names of these people. It doesn't detail the potential charges against them, and we have no idea what the decision-making was behind the DA's decision not to bring those charges against the individuals who were named but not charged. But it's significant nonetheless, and it's going to become something that we're all going to chew on and talk about for some time to come.
Katie Fang, I'm seeing here on page 7, Lindsey Graham's name is in here. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I kind of wanted to quickly lay a foundation on it for when your viewers are able to actually look at this report, which it is available publicly. Let me just highlight that for everybody. So the way that they've set this up is they basically say, as for example, Roman numeral 7, when you're turning to that page 7 where you see Lindsey Graham, with respect to the national efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election, focus on efforts in Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia. The grand jury recommends that the district attorney seek indictments of the following persons, including votes. So they list the names, including Lindsey Graham, which of course is huge, United States Senator, but then they also include the votes. And so you can see who voted yes, who voted no, and who abstained. And there is there's a nay vote or a no vote for almost all of them, but it's interesting that Lindsey Graham actually got 13 yes, 7 no, and 1 abstention. But Lindsey Graham's name is notable. But Anna, you know who else is here that's also notable is Kelly Loeffler. You remember her? She failed to keep her seat in Congress as well, but she also was a huge Trump supporter. There was a recommendation that she be indicted. We see Boris Epstein, or Epstein, whatever iteration he's going with today. He is known to be the quarterback for the Donald Trump legal team. His name is recommended for purposes of an indictment. And then I also want to note 2 names, Kirk Hilbert and Alex Kaufman. Why should we care about those names? Well, they were actually identified as witnesses by the state of Georgia in that evidentiary hearing with Mark Meadows for purposes of his removal. At the end of the day, they only called Alex Kaufman, who is a local Georgia attorney, who was the attorney that was representing Trump in the campaign for the litigation that he brought in the state of Georgia. But Alex Kaufman is also listed. And so these are lawyers, or these are people that are the boots on the ground in these states. And I'll just say very, very quickly, Anna, before I turn it back to you, they list these states, and why this is important, guys, is because these states have been conducting their own investigations into election fraud. And so what does that mean? That means that there could be further criminal exposure for Donald Trump, his contemporaries, his associates, his allies in some of these states. And so the actual criminal exposure for Donald Trump may not be done. It may not just be done with these 4 indictments that we've seen so far. And so I want to emphasize that.
Okay, and you're talking about potentially his involvement in other states and potential state charges that could then later come in individual states where he's been implicated and some of these other players are implicated. Hannah Zudavin, obviously the January 6th committee, did a lot of work that is intertwined with this particular investigation. As you hear or read these names for yourself, can you speak to that intersection of what we're seeing here and your committee's work?
You had McDonald's breakfast though, right?
Yeah, Anna, these names are familiar, right? The people on the panel named some of them. I think Cleta Mitchell is an example of someone that we didn't talk about as much during our public hearings, but she was brought in by Mark Meadows, really close after when the election was done, and she's actually the person that reached out to John Eastman, who we're a little bit more familiar with, saying, can you help me with this legal theory about state legislators, right? So these are names that we're familiar with. I think one, Michael Flynn, which is interesting. Michael Flynn was really involved on the ground on the day before January 6th, giving speeches on behalf of stopping the steal. Michael Flynn pled the fifth to us, to the January 6th Select Committee. So as we're saying these names, I'm excited about the information that we're going to get, the more information we're going to get from some of these people. As Katie just mentioned, this was a sweeping organization tried to overturn the 2020 election in many different states. We know that. We know that Fani Willis is including the efforts in other states, including Georgia. So as we continue to find out more information than we already have, these names are familiar, but we're seeing who they talked to, right? Who they decided was maybe worth an indictment or not. And I'm excited to read more as we kind of brush through this in this hour.
Were you surprised to see Lindsey Graham's name or David Perdue's name in these documents, Hannah?
This was a sweeping list of witnesses that she was able to speak to. Fani Willis, pretty immediately after January 6th, Congress a little bit of time to vote to get the resolution to pass the January 6th Select Committee. We had to get staffed up. We only had about a year of investigative time. So the fact that she was able to talk to some more witnesses is not surprising to me. I was initially surprised to hear those names, but it'll be interesting to see what information they could provide, right? We know that Lindsey Graham was close with Donald Trump. We know that he texted a lot of people, but we'll see, right? David Perdue in Georgia, maybe not as surprising to understand what was happening on this day. People forget that on January 6th, we also had the results of that election in Georgia, right? We forget about it because January 6th was such a big deal, but that election was key for Democrats to win the Senate. And so a lot of stuff was happening around this time, and it's clear that Benny Willis has been on top of it.
And let me just read a little bit here for our viewers, because as I'm looking at these documents and I'm trying to put all the pieces together, there's a lot of numbers actually on the side of some of these documents. And there's this on page 6 under section 7, it says, with respect to the national effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election, focused on efforts in Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia. The grand jury recommends that the district attorney seek indictments of the following persons, including votes, and then it lists a long list of people, including 30 plus names. That's where we see Lindsey Graham's list. That's where we see people like Boris Epstein, who I think Ken mentioned, along with David Perdue, and along with a lot of the names and people who were, in fact, indicted by that grand jury. So if I'm understanding this right, Lisa, these names are people that this special grand jury believes should have been indicted. They're not just people that were called as witnesses.
No, and specifically, the charge that's being recommended in this section 7 against what I count as 39 people here is the state RICO charge. So the recommendation of the special grand jury was that Lynn Wood, another former Trump attorney, Lindsey Graham, Mike Flynn, Boris Epstein, Cleta Mitchell be included among those people who were charged with the overarching conspiracy to overturn the results of the 2020 election in Georgia. Those are names that are not included in the indictment on that charge or other charges, and understanding why will be part of what you, me, and all of the rest of our guests spend a number of the next days and weeks trying to unpack.
And I'm told it is 21 people additionally who were recommended by the special grand jury to face an indictment, who ultimately were not indicted when the DA put out the indictment a couple of weeks ago with the 19 names. So Clark Cunningham, I'd like to get your reaction to that gap. How do you explain it?
Well, the special grand jury report, as you describe it, is way more interesting than I expected it to be. Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Let's start with Lindsey Graham, who I certainly did not expect to be recommended for indictment, and I believe was told was not a target of the special grand jury. We understand, I mean, he testified in front of the special grand jury. When he came out, he said he answered all the questions he was asked, which suggests that he did not take the fifth. But the special grand jury listened to him, testified under oath, and then decided he was a criminal. That's astonishing. David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler, I think we have to remember that both of them came out and demanded that the Secretary of State resign with no basis other than that Donald Trump told them to do that. I suspect that that's a reason that they're part of the RICO conspiracy. So that's fascinating. The three lawyers, Kaufman, Mitchell, and Hillard, were all on the infamous phone call in January, I believe.
That's right. Well,
and so I think that's why they're in there. Yeah, and the other ones were as well. She was kind of the lead on it. I wonder if any of them are cooperating. That would be really interesting. We may eventually find out.
Could it be that some of these people ultimately could end up indicted? We've seen superseding indictments, for example,
Absolutely.
in at least one of the federal cases.
Absolutely.
And so, I guess, is that likely? Now that we know their names, is this one of those situations, Katie, I'll ask you this, is it a situation in which, okay, their names are already out there. Clearly the DA at this point doesn't feel like this is a risk to let them know that they were recommended to be indicted. So help me understand how you square that.
Yeah, so we'll square that circle a little bit right now. So recall, let's move a couple months back. Do you remember part of the indicted by the grand jury. And so there's this issue of immunity. There's this issue of cooperation. To Clark's point, Alex Kaufman did not testify, but Kurt Hilbert did testify at that evidentiary hearing on behalf of the state. I don't know if it was pursuant to a subpoena, so we had to appear, but at the end of the day, there is a level of cooperation that we are not totally privy to. But I will add just very quickly, the grand jury took evidence, heard evidence, and made a decision. If I'm Fonnie Willis, I'm not going to supplant that discretion that was exercised by the grand jury and try to pursue more, frankly. I would let it be where it is. You have 19 co-defendants that are facing a number of felony charges. I think in and of that self, I think you trusted the grand jury in its capacity, took the evidence and returned a true bill on what they thought and who they thought was appropriate for charges. So I would not expect to see in any capacity a superseding indictment at this time. I think what you have is what you have. I think this is what Fonnie Willis is going to move forward with. And I think the special grand jury report is illustrative of exactly how Georgia works and how different it works with the special grand jury sitting in its capacity. Remember, Donald Trump tried his damnedest to make sure that we didn't see this report. He tried to get not only the entirety of the report abolished and dismissed, but that we couldn't see it. And so there's a good reason why. Because these are all of his associates. These are the people that helped him in every capacity on a state and a national level to subvert the American democracy and the beliefs that got Joe Biden into office. And I think because of that, I think that's the reason why Fonnie Willis is going to say, I made my presentation, I'm just going to let it be.
I know we are working behind the scenes to get reaction now from this long list of people, from their representatives who are now on this 21 additional person list who aren't indicted but were recommended to be indicted by the special grand jury. Candelanian, are we getting any reaction yet? And what else can you tell us about what you may be learning as to why there is such a big gap of who was indicted and who wasn't?
Just checked my phone to see if we've gotten any updates on reaction. I'm not seeing anything, Anna, but just so our viewers understand, and expanding on Katie's point, they're seeing a list of people that a special grand jury recommended being charged criminally, and they know that, in fact, the DA decided not to charge those people. So what are the possible reasons? The issue of that some of them may be cooperating, as one of our guests mentioned, is a possible reason. Another reason is those people may have had substantial defenses, some of them, that DA Fonnie Willis took a look at and said, you know what, at the end of the day, a criminal charge is not warranted here. For example, Senator Lindsey Graham has argued that all the actions he was taking, whether you believe this or not, was in his capacity as a U.S. Senator concerned about potential irregularities in the election, making calls, and members of Congress have a pretty strong presumption of immunity acting as legislatures. There's something called the speech and debate clause in the Constitution. They're immune from things they say on the floor of Congress, and that has extended to other areas. So whether you believe it or not, it may have been an issue that Fonnie Willis took a look at and said, we may not be able to overcome this defense. For example, Attorney Cleta Mitchell may have argued that she was acting as an attorney in making the actions that she took, and there's a difference in conduct. They're taking a look at actions people took, phone calls people made. Did they cross a certain line? All these are the kinds of calculations that prosecutors would have made. And unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get the answers in detail to this because it's all secret. A criminal grand jury's deliberations are secret. It may be some time until we get fidelity on exactly why these people were not charged.
Lisa, where is that line, right? We did see a number of lawyers get indicted. Rudy Giuliani, Eastman, Chesbrough, for example, and yet you have other lawyers like Cleta Mitchell who were not indicted. And so when you have the argument coming from the people who were indicted that I was just acting in my duties as a lawyer, this isn't indictable, this wasn't a crime, that's the argument they're trying to make. But obviously, clearly, Fonnie Willis thought their argument didn't stand up.
Well, there are a number of instances in which the lawyers who are a part of the indictment went far and beyond what Katie, Clark, Ken, or I would consider the normal practice of law. In particular, when I think about Rudy Giuliani and Judge Ellis, for example, they went on road shows to various state legislatures. They held special hearings where they made a number of representations about alleged facts having to do with election fraud in those respective states. They talked about dead voters, ineligible voters, voting machine fraud, all unsubstantiated allegations that in some cases those same people said to different audiences were unsubstantiated. That's not part of the practice of law. They were not acting as lawyers in capacity with a particular litigation or even as an advocate for the campaign when they out and out lied to members of state legislatures about what happened in the 2020 election. So let's start there.
But Cleta Mitchell was on that phone call with Ravensburger, right? She didn't stop Trump from going.
She didn't, but we don't know. You know, to Ken's point, we don't know why Cleta Mitchell wasn't charged. And I want to raise a point about Cleta Mitchell and a couple of the other attorneys that I think is also salient. Cleta Mitchell, like Kurt Hilbert and Alex Kaufman, have a number of communications with John Eastman and his role here that could have been particularly important to Fani Willis and her team. Cleta Mitchell is the reason, for example, John Eastman even got involved in investigating whether or not Mike Pence would have the power to say no to the legitimately chosen electors. She asked him to opine on that very early on in the process. Kurt Hilbert and Alex Kaufman were two members of the Georgia litigation team to whom John Eastman said, hey, wait, I have concerns about the president signing this complaint because it contends that things we now know not to be true were in fact true. So their relation to John Eastman, their interactions with him and others may have made them particularly attractive targets for cooperation agreements. I'm not telling you that we know that that happened, but it's very plausible to me that they could have been approached given what else they knew beyond the subject matter that, you know, this special grand jury report says they could have been charged.
Katie?
Yeah, so I just want to quickly mention a couple of things. One, the special grand jurors said in this report, we're not lawyers. So what we did was we had these DAs come and they said, these are the statutes that are relevant. And then what the jurors did, they plugged and played. They took the evidence, they listened to the witnesses testify, and then this is their recommendation. And so I want to make sure this is clear. This is not a release from the DA's office. This is not from Fani Willis. This is from the special grand jurors themselves. They are civilians that were brought to sit in service, you know, and do their public service by doing this. And so I want to make sure in terms of the legal connections we're trying to draw between the statutes that are cited and the names that are cited in here may not necessarily, quote, make the legal sense that we think as lawyers or otherwise it would make, but it made sense to these particular jurors. Second thing, we know that the DA's office has said that they have 150 witnesses for their case. These are witnesses. You're looking at a preliminary witness list for the DA's office. We haven't seen the initial discovery exhibits that have been turned over, which means it includes the names of the witnesses and the evidence that they have. But I can reasonably anticipate seeing a lot of these names being released by Fani Willis for purposes of proving their case. That huge list of names that we keep on highlighting, Anna, that starts on page 7, and it's a list of 39 names or so. By the way, the current Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, Burt Jones, his name is on this too, by the way. The guy is actually sitting in the state capitol right now. But that particular section 7, with all those names, that's the RICO charge. And so these jurors said to themselves, based upon the evidence they heard, these 39 people, they violated the state RICO statute in Georgia, and we recommend to Fani Willis that she indict them. But again, this is just their non-legal recommendations.
And just so people understand the list that we're talking about, I'm just going to hold up my paper for those at home. I mean, this is literally what we're looking at. It is a name, and there are numbers on each side. This is one whole page. This is page 7, and then it carries over into page 8. And so you mentioned these could be witnesses. These could be potential cooperators. Clark, you brought that up as well. And that stands out to me because it, even though, doesn't, you know, say a whole lot about, we don't know anything about exactly why they were not charged. Ultimately, this got to send a message to those who were charged, no?
Well, there are 2 points that you're asking I'd like to make. One is to follow up on what Katie was saying. I mean, what we see here is a combination of democracy and the rule of law in action. I mean, this is a cross-section of residents of Fulton County selected randomly who worked really hard and conscientiously and came up with these conclusions. So the whole idea that this is a personal witch hunt by Fani Willis is, I think, rebutted to a significant degree by actually seeing this report, which is citizens like you and me working hard to try to figure out things. The other thing is, I do want to suggest that there may be a reason we could see some additional indictments, perhaps of these people, and that is if some of the current 19 defendants cooperate. And I think that's going to happen. I think some of them are going to plead guilty and cooperate. They may fill in the missing pieces that would allow DA Willis to decide that some of these people should be indicted.
What
And I'm
happened
also
to
reading, a majority of the grand
South
jury believes that the perjury
You
may have been
making
committed by
touch
one or more witnesses testifying before it. The grand jury recommends that the district attorney seek appropriate indictments for such crimes where the evidence is compelling. Lisa, I don't recall seeing any charges for perjury. Do you
No.
think that's
Oh, yes,
outstanding?
Robert Shealy.
Oh, Shealy? I'm
Yeah.
sorry. Say it again, Clark, for us.
Yes, there is a perjury charge in the indictment against Attorney Robert Shealy. So that's who I think they're talking about.
Well, thank you for
Specifically
pointing that out.
charged the perjury to the special grand jury.
And I appreciate that clarity. You know, it says in this report, one or more witnesses. I think when we saw the initial version of this grand jury report that was redacted to high heaven, as Katie mentioned earlier, one of the things people like us were looking for was, would they give more detail about who potentially had perjured themselves? This does not. As Clark just noted, Robert Shealy is a person against whom perjury charges have been brought. Whether or not the special purpose grand jury was thinking about others who may have perjured themselves, and whether or not the district attorney and her team used that as leverage to cut some of the cooperation deals we believe could have been in the works, is something we don't know, but certainly is a possibility. I want to mention a couple of other things. One of the people who's on our list of the 21 additional people against whom charges were recommended but not brought is Burt Jones, who, as Katie noted, is the current lieutenant governor. He's also a person that Fani Willis is not eligible to further investigate or prosecute. Why? Because she attended a fundraiser for his political opponent and was found to be disqualified, essentially, from further proceeding against him. My understanding is that to the extent that charges are justified against Burt Jones, they will have to be brought by another prosecutor in the state, but that's still a looming question mark. So while I agree overall with Katie, we're not going to see a superseding indictment here, I think Burt Jones is the single person for whom there's a question mark in my head about whether he can face some further criminal exposure.
And so can you speak to that process there in Georgia, Clark? If there were to be accountability, if there is potentially a crime committed by the lieutenant governor, but because the current DA, Fani Willis's hands are tied there, what's the process for accountability then?
So the director of the prosecuting attorney's council of Georgia has already asked to see the special grand jury report, and it's up to him to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate whether Burt Jones should be prosecuted. So he was waiting to see this report. And the fact that Jones is named in the report, even though the DA was prohibited from prosecuting him, I think certainly increases the probability that there will be a serious investigation of Burt Jones.
And I'm told our Garrett Hake is standing by and is working to get reaction from members of Capitol Hill for us. Garrett, what are you hearing?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, I'm looking through this with a particular focus on the 3 Republican senators, or one still Republican senator, 3 at the time, who were recommended to be charged in this case, but against whom charges were not ultimately filed: Lindsey Graham, Kelly Loeffler, and David Perdue. Perdue and Loeffler would later go on to lose in those Georgia runoff races that gave Democrats control of the Senate. It was sort of the pivotal moment of 2021 up to January 6th, right? Those January 3rd elections that became the Senate majority. And I'm going through the filing here, and it's just interesting to note that of all these votes against all of these defendants and non-defendants, there is significant division among the special grand jurors about charging Graham, Loeffler, and Perdue, with 4 no votes for Perdue, 6 for Loeffler, 7 for Graham, and a footnote here saying that one of the dissenting jurors decided against seeking indictments. Basically, they say because this conduct was political, they felt, and didn't rise to the level of criminal. That dovetails almost completely with the argument that Donald Trump is going to make in this case, that his conduct is purely political and doesn't rise to the level of criminality. And at least some of these special purpose grand jurors agreed with them. Now, the Senate finished up their work yesterday for the week and headed home, so it's going to take us a bit of time to track down these folks. But Graham in particular has been pretty open. I remember interviewing him in January of 2021 about this, saying, why would a senator from South Carolina have such interest in the actions of, your neighboring state? And he was a believer at the time in the possibility of some kind of electoral malfeasance, and he since said that there hasn't been any. The cases of Perdue and Loeffler are a little bit different. Remember, Perdue ran against Brian Kemp, the governor of Georgia, as a Donald Trump-backed candidate. He got smoked by Kemp in that primary because really the only significant policy difference that he ran on was a belief that the 2020 election got stolen. And so, Kemp has won on defending the elections in Georgia, and whether or not Loeffler or Perdue, who are still in the Trump orbit, but functionally out of elected politics right now, still believe this or not may be relevant here. We'll see if they have anything to say about the non-decision or the decision ultimately not to prosecute them despite this special grand jury's recommendation on it.
Garrett, do you think Lindsey Graham is concerned about his continued potential legal exposure?
I doubt it. I mean, Graham would have testified during this window back in 2022 when this grand jury was speaking. He was meeting publicly. He's been very open in his comments publicly about